So ultimately, what this PhD project enabled me to do is integrate all the different aspects of MD PhD training into a PhD project that had me working with the patients, with the neurosurgeons, with the neurologists, with the psychiatrists. And ultimately, what it looked like was a little bit different than a traditional PhD. So the big takeaway I would want to convey is choose a risky PhD project. Choose something that tries to merge everything that your interests live in, and use that opportunity to gain both medical training and scientific training as best as you can. And having a group of mentors that are supportive of this riskiness and who will push back and really ask you whether it's worth it or not is crucial to actually seeing a PhD that you feel proud of, that you're very excited about even after 7-8 years. So having that risky PhD project, I think, really tied my MD PhD experience together. So what was the result of the PhD? So the goal was to really understand what DBS did to measurable brain signals in the short and the long term. And I'll talk very briefly about the science and the engineering outcomes of this PhD. What we did with each patient was we implanted an electrode, we stimulated those very specific white matter tracts you can see here in different colors, and we recorded from that region in 2 different settings. One setting was in the short term, when we stimulate at that right spot, when we stimulate those white matter tracts, what happens to brain signals? And what happens to those brain signals that doesn't happen when you're off target, when you're not at the right spot? And then at the same time, we were able to record recordings multiple times a day over 7 months as the patients got better from depression. So what parts of the brain signal that we were recording from this region actually helped us predict how depression evolved in these patients, or something we call a depression biometric? Can we actually listen in on the activity happening in the SCC and predict how depressed a patient is based off of the rhythms in the brain? And what we found was in the short term, when we hit the right spot, when we hit that sweet spot with all the white matter tracts, we evoke this very specific pattern in the brain. That pattern looks very much like a right-sided effect, that whatever DBS is doing, it's primarily affecting the right side, even though we're stimulating on both the left and the right side. This gives us a little bit of a hint as to what networks we're actually modulating, but we needed to know that this was specific to on target. So when we, in the exact same patients, stimulate 3 millimeters away at an off-target region, we see a very different pattern emerge in each patient to what brain signals were actually changed. And we notice that the on-target gives a little bit more nuanced effect, where certain regions go up, which are in red, certain regions go down, which are in blue. And on the off-target, you kind of have this broad increase in activity. This provided some hints as to what we were doing to the networks and what the networks actually were that were being modulated by DBS. But it doesn't address the question of what depression is. So what we did was we looked at our long-term recordings and took a machine learning-based approach using regularized linear regression to develop a model that linked the brain activity in each patient to their specific patient's individualized depression recovery trajectory, learned a model using about half the data set, which was something around 2,000, 3,000 recordings. And then we took that model and see how well it performed in predicting how depressed the patient was solely from their brain recordings. So what you see in these plots are 4 patients worth of recovery trajectories after DBS. And in orange, you'll see the Hamilton score that they filled out in their weekly clinical visits with the psychiatrist. That's a measure of how depressed they are. So higher values are worse depression and lower values are recovery from depression. And in blue, you'll see the prediction from the model that was trained on just the recordings from the SCC LFP, the local field potentials coming from the SCC region that we implanted. And overall, we found we were able to account for about 30% of the variance in the depression recovery signal. And that 30% is statistically significant in that we couldn't be able to randomly make that blue curve look like the orange curve in the results that we actually ended up seeing. So what we found was a statistically robust prediction, but that prediction only accounted for part of what depression looked like. And that makes a lot of sense because we know depression is a network disease that involves much more than the region we're measuring from. So this gives us an idea of what other regions should we be recording from to maybe get a better prediction of how depressed the patients are. And that we actually have a few hints from our short-term recordings, the on-target and the off-target experiments. Maybe we should be listening on these other regions that we know DBS modulates. And together, with recordings in the SCC and in distributed recordings across the brain, we should be able to predict much more accurately how depressed a patient is, and then actually change our management based off of the neural recordings instead of necessarily how their response is, which can actually be surprisingly variable between patients. So the ultimate end goal of all this is we gained a short-term understanding of how DBS actually changes the brain state. Where does it move? Does it move in the SCC region, or does it move in the EEG? And then over the long term, where the brain state goes as the patients get better and better. There's a key piece of this that's missing that I'm hoping to actually address in my career, which is what are these other regions doing? What are the distributed brain regions doing as the patient gets better over the course of 7 months? We were not able to record from hundreds of regions, but we are developing that ability in neurosurgery today. And that is a very recent advance that our collaborators and colleagues have advanced in the last 2 years that enables us to record from a lot more regions. So coming out of this PhD, I feel very ready to hit the ground running with a lot of the directions that modern DBS research is going. And why that is because throughout this PhD, I was relentless in identifying the skills that I needed to learn and then going and actually learning them. That piece of it was with the support of everyone here in the program, but also with some pushback. Why do you want to go back and take courses? Why do you want to go learn about machine learning? It's not something that's used in neuroscience. Why do you want to go learn about control theory? That's not something that's really made its way into neuroengineering. Going back to school in the 3rd or 4th year of my PhD, I went and got a master's in electrical engineering at Georgia Tech, something that was never on my radar when I was deciding which MD PhD program to go to. That master's ended up broadening my horizons and giving me perspective that ended up helping me actually anticipate the direction that the field was going to go, and then learn the machine learning skills and learn the control theory skills that are becoming in demand in the field of neuroengineering now. So it came at a cost in terms of productivity with respect to papers. I will readily admit that, but I come out of it a lot more comfortable as a physician scientist, anticipating the needs of an independent lab that I'll hopefully get an opportunity to run in the next 5 to 10 years. So I didn't feel ready. That being said, I didn't feel ready. At the end of my PhD, there were still some skills that needed to be learned, skills that were not in neuroscience quite yet, but that others in the physics community had actually developed. And what I ended up doing was I looked at my data. So we have our data over here that came from the patients. And I wanted to understand, what models of the brain are most consistent with the data that we saw. This is a very different perspective than I took in my PhD, which was collect the data and then try to see in the data what the truth actually is. And that's like trying to understand an elephant and try to draw an elephant or sculpt an elephant using just the shadows that it makes when you shine a light or a flashlight on it. So here we flipped it and I looked at the data, but I looked at the data from the context of whole brain models. And so this took me over to Marseille, France, where I worked with the Virtual Brain Group. And under the advisorship of Dr. Victor Yursa and the support of the Witter International Program, I was able to actually apply their whole brain models into the data set that we collected and use the patient-specific tractography to try to make sense of it all. And so what you'll see here in these 3 panels is a purely computational, purely simulation-based approach to trying to predict where we would see EEG changes if we were stimulating the white matter tracts in a specific way. And that specific way was a hypothesis. And we had several hypotheses. We thought maybe stimulation would synchronize brain regions. We, in other cases, thought the DBS with desynchronized brain regions. So which one of these is most consistent? Which one of it looks the closest to the data that we collected? And it turns out that a desynchronization model, which is what I'm plotting here and showing here, made the most sense when it came to predicting where our EEG changes would be. So you'll see that there's a matching here in the primary and secondary EEG channel prediction and the actual empirical data. Not quite 100% proof. It's not one of those, yep, we solved it kind of things, but it does help us guide how we should think about testing our hypotheses in the context of patients that are very, very different from each other. We're not going to be able to run these clear-cut, very controlled experiments. So using computational modeling, we can come in and develop patient-specific statistics and then see how well the data in each patient actually matches with the model or the statistics that you develop on each patient perspective. So this actually lays a good foundation for the work that I want to do clinically, specifically as a neurosurgeon, where you're in the operating room trying to figure out which tracks you want to stimulate. You have an idea of how DBS works, and you want to quickly see if the region that you have to implant actually gives you the pattern that you expect. Does it give you the cortical responses that you expect to see in someone who gets better? You use whatever tools you can in the operating room to say, yep, I think this will work. And then you close them up and you see how they do over the course of 7 months. That is a step forward in the field of DBS. That is actually improving the modern way of doing DBS using computational mathematical understanding that lets us be consistent with the data that we're collecting. But that wasn't enough for me. So what I had to do was I wanted to understand how these brain models function independent of data. I wanted to understand a little bit more, not only how do you interpret clinical data in its messiness, how do you actually understand the ways that the brain could theoretically function. And so what this led me to was a much more mathematics-oriented, theory-oriented project where I tried to understand how networks of brain regions, idealized brain regions, could theoretically interact with each other. And this involved bringing in control theory, bringing in a lot of the work that is being used to develop self-driving cars. Actually, how do you use that math to understand how you can almost drive the brain's state around? How do you find out where you are in the brain? And then how do you actually put the accelerator? How do you put the brake? How do you turn right? How do you turn left? How does DBS actually act like a car in having us move the brain state in a way that we would want to move them? In our patients with depression, we moved the state to something that let them be free of symptoms. We don't know where we did, we don't know how we did it, but we know at the end that the patients do better. So we're almost reverse engineering the brain and the brain's response to DBS. And for that, control theory is a perfect tool because they've been doing this type of work for about 70, 80 years. And modern tools in machine learning have actually enabled control theory to be a lot more data congruent, even in messy systems, even in complicated systems like the brain. So ultimately, I got some dedicated time in Marseille to sit and really understand the models. What is theoretically the limit of how brain networks can work? Because if I know that in theory, there's a limit to how much we can actually improve the brain state, in practice, it's going to be quite a bit less. As a physician, that's going to be very important because this type of modeling can actually help inform where we should stimulate, how we should stimulate, how we should record from the brain. All of these things have explicit mathematical structures that we can actually use in the context of patients and individual patients to improve DBS and improve our understanding of the neural underpinnings of depression. Ultimately, all of this was in service to patient care. So in the last year, I've actually been entirely dedicated to clinical training here in Atlanta. And I say here in Atlanta specifically because Emory has a very unique ecosystem of hospitals. We've got Emory University Hospital right on Emory's campus that enables tightly knit work with academics and academia. And you'll see a lot of our DBS work was done here at Emory University Hospital. We also have institutions like Emory University Hospital Midtown, which has a very different financial structure. a very different health management structure to the university hospital that gives a very different idea of what private practice and private practice with academia looks like. We have Scottish Rite, which is actually a pediatric hospital that gives you a very different patient population. And ultimately, most of us will spend the most time at Grady Memorial Hospital. And Grady is an amazing opportunity and a privilege for us as medical students to work in. Mostly because at Grady, we as medical students make a huge impact in talking to patients, in understanding patients, in really getting to the bottom of what they could what they could have, and how we can actually help the clinicians, help the physicians in a very resource-strained environment get to the bottom of what our patients are suffering from and how we can best treat them using the methods available to us as physicians. So training at Grady has been an absolute privilege and an absolutely amazing opportunity to really learn how to be a physician. Even as a student, we find ourselves in the operating room actively helping in every single aspect of the surgery. And in the medical wards, you're helping in every single aspect of the patient's medical care. And a lot of what we see there translates directly into us being absolutely top-notch clinicians as we come out of medical school, ready for intern year of residency and ready for a larger career where clinical care of patients is central to our goals as a physician scientist, not secondary or tertiary. That patient care is at the core of what we do, and our goal is to understand to improve patient care. I think the training at Grady, coupled with the PhD that's risky, enables you to really prepare yourself for a physician scientist career. And I think this is more important than ever. The curriculum here at Emory is very, very much strengthened by the Georgia Tech connection. So a lot of what we're seeing in our clinical training today is a relatively seamless transition to virtual curriculum. And what we have here is an opportunity that I had well before a lot of what's happening right now. Last July, we had the opportunity to actually work in surgical robotics, that we're getting surgical robotics training as medical students in parallel with a surgery clerkship, that we're in the operating room, getting to understand how the operating room works, understanding the principles of surgery, and at the same time, actually getting hands-on experience in modern and futuristic tools for how surgery is going to get done. So the clinical experience has been a unique opportunity to dedicate myself to training as a clinician, but it's actually also been an amazing continuation of the training I received at Georgia Tech, at the training I received at Emory in the PhD training, because it enabled me to actually translate the PhD training concepts from the PhD into clinical practice and do it at every level you can imagine, on the interpersonal level, on the surgery level, on the virtual level. It's really an integrated curriculum where the PhD and the MD are not just separate from each other, that they actually feed into each other and strengthen each other to make you the best physician scientist I think you can possibly be. Basically, that's the place where we really, really learn how to be physicians. And as an engineer, from my perspective, this was really the garage. This was where the knowledge hit the ground and really was put to use in improving lives. And we get direct training in that. And that goes a really long way towards not only preparing you as a physician scientist, but also leaving you, I think, passionate and compassionate for the career you have set aside for you. So real quick comment on the training environment that you're going into. So I started in 2011 and I come in with an engineering background. So this is the way I thought. I thought about the engineering process, which was it is a very iterative process. And the goal of it is to understand the system, understand what the problem is, figure out in each part of the problem, what can science help us understand? But if science can't help us understand, we have to do what we have to do, and we have to do our best using whatever experiences we have to improve, and then hopefully tomorrow ask the question again, but have a little bit more understanding. that looked an awful lot like what my training as a physician was in the preclinical curriculum. And it definitely looks identical to what my training was as a clinician this last year. And so the engineering process and the clinical design, the clinical decision-making process really complement each other very, very well. And they become very important because they are the main interface with patients. As a frontline physician, you were the one listening to the patient, listening to their problems, getting an idea of not only what the problems are, but how we can go about solving it, given all the constraints that are endemic to our healthcare system. You need to be able to listen to the patients, figure out what their goals are, figure out what tools are available to actually solve the problems, and then interact with the scientists who train rigorously in really understanding the fundamentals of a problem. How do the atoms, how do the indivisible portions of our system interact with each other? And so our job in interacting with patients becomes almost hypothesis generation. Here are the things you might want to look at because in the clinic, this worked. Or, boy, this patient is saying these things are problematic and they went with each other, so maybe there's a link between the two. Go find out if causation is involved or is it just correlation. And the scientist really does it rigorously by understanding, okay, this is the hypothesis that I think the clinicians are telling me. This is what the data would look like if there was no connection, like the clinicians don't think there is. And we'll see which one actually makes the most sense in a very well-designed, very carefully designed experiment. Our job as physicians and scientists is in the middle between our patients and the scientists. It's really to be able to take understanding, many different understandings, figure out which of these hypotheses is most likely, and then acting in our patient's best interest based off of which one is the most data congruent. And why I think that's crucially important is we can't wait until scientific progress gets to the level of rigor that we demand in the science world before we treat our patients. That patient's coming in today, that patient has a life-threatening condition, you gotta make it happen. And while you're making it happen, while you're leveraging modern scientific tools to address the problem, science is going on and you need to be aware of what's happening in the scientific world to be able to translate seamlessly between these two. And so ultimately, what the job of an MD PhD is, I would propose, is to learn how to learn in messy environments. How do you try to figure out from the patient what's going wrong, and then how do you figure out from other physicians what the best course of action would be to solve what's going wrong using whatever tools we have available today. And then how do you ask these questions in a way that you can actually help the scientific world answer them while you're also trying to address it from a parallel perspective. I want to stress that training is very, very difficult. And I think we are at a strange point in medical education where we don't quite know how to do this type of training. I was very fortunate that I started in 2011. I came in with a gut feeling that control theory, machine learning, these things would be central to how we do things as clinicians. And the folks here at Emory, I think, were very enthusiastic about it and were very supportive of that and supported the last 9 years of my training in exactly this type of environment. And it was difficult, but the support that's provided by the administration here, by the other students here, by Georgia Tech, by the CDC, by all these phenomenal institutions really came together to enable this type of thinking that I'm very fortunate to embody today. So why that's important is the context matters. So we are the middle folks between patients and scientists, but we're also the middle folks in society, and really understanding where we are in between academia, within community, within private practice, public practice, all these things. Understanding our context, I think, is crucial to our training as MD PhDs. And that is a factor that has been incredibly important in my life and incredibly important in my training, mostly because this is the place you choose to go as an MD PhD is going to be where you're going to be home for at least 8 years. It's going to be where you make friends, where you have a support system, where you find hobbies, where you run, where you engage politically. This is the home that you're going to choose for a while. And making sure that there are people there that support you, that are similar and have a community around you is crucially important. But more than that, I think it's understanding the larger context even of where you're doing your training. So like I said, I got to do a postdoc in France, and that's Marseille down there. And what it provided was a very different perspective on how to think about problems, a very different perspective on how medicine, engineering, and science interact. I came to appreciate the environment here in Atlanta and the US as a whole a lot more after interacting with folks internationally, realizing that medicine and science don't really interact much in the outside world. And a lot of that is because the training system set up elsewhere, they kind of force you to decide what you want to do pretty early. Into college, you have to have a pretty clear idea of what you want to do with your career. If there's one thing you take away from this is that I really, to this day, kind of don't have a clear idea of what I want to do. And having a program that supports that, having a program that supports context and understanding that you want to see as much as possible is actually, that's a strength, and it's actually going to solidify your career moving forward. In between all of this, in between the hyper-local here in Atlanta and the global perspective, I was very fortunate to actually interact with our political system at various levels. So I had the opportunity to go speak with Congressman John Lewis, who is one of our representatives here in Atlanta. This was back in 2017, 2018, right as a major piece of legislation, the tax reform bill, was actually making its way through Congress. And it had a provision in it that was actually very, very detrimental to grad students, especially MD, PhD grad students, because it was going to tax tuition as a income. Long story short, we don't need to get nitty gritty there, but we got together as a student body here at Emory, here at Georgia Tech, and across Georgia, and actually reached out to our congressional representatives in DC, talking face to face, really interacting and really telling them how important this training was to us. And in a small way, actually got that provision removed from the tax bill. That was a national effort, but it was a national effort informed by each of our individual experiences. And the MD PhD program here was incredibly supportive throughout all of this. And this experience that I had in that year dovetailed perfectly with my transition out of PhD into med school, and helped me understand a little bit more of the context of where our research lives, but then also where our clinical care of our patients actually lives. That politics provides that very important context that we're always going to interact with, that I think is becoming very apparent today, especially, is that political context is crucial to actually us taking care of our patients and us doing our science. On a lighter note, also being able to go explore the world and see all these different communities and all these different people, I think is important to remind you through this long process what it is we're doing this process for. 8 years is a long time. A lot of things happen in 8 years, and the MD PhD was something that I was always happy to do, I think, because I had this opportunity to explore. And in the middle of the PhD, I made sure to go to as many conferences as I could, made sure to go to as many collaborator meetings as I could. Academia provides this very great opportunity to really reach out and exchange cultures, exchange ideas. And in the process of doing that, you really gain experiences that help you directly as a clinician, because it helps you bond with patients. It helps you understand the patient's context a little bit more. There were several times that I spoke with a patient and a physician about that time in Switzerland, or that time in South Africa, or that time in Puerto Rico. There's this ability that you gain while traveling to really connect with people in a way that is our job as physicians. And then finally, it gives the MD PhD, especially here at Emory, as I've noticed, gives us a lot of opportunities to interact with politics and with the media as a whole. So I had the opportunity to speak with CNN about a lot of the tax bill issues that I was speaking with Representative Lewis about. And in interacting with the media, you're really learning how to communicate with patients. How do you translate complicated ideas about like PhD training or deep brain stimulation for depression? How do you convey these ideas in a way that people can resonate with and appreciate, and then actually turn around and help advocate for the work that we do as physician scientists. I think all of these come together and provide a context for the work that I was doing in the PhD, and really stressing to me why I was doing the PhD, why I was doing the clinical training, and really understanding what the light at the end of the tunnel was, even as I was in the middle of the tunnel. So I think engaging with the community, especially when you have the chance to, is crucially important. And I know there's a lot of stuff going on right now that limit our ability to explore the world, to talk to each other, to interact with each other face to face. And what we're doing is we're working as hard as we can, all of us, to actually move through this back to a world that hopefully provides for both our patients and provides for our health as physicians. So the only thing I want to say is when you get the opportunity to travel, definitely get a chance to travel. When you get an opportunity to connect with people around you and communities around you, take the opportunity. Even if it seems like it slows down your training a little bit, I think having supportive people was important, but then also I think reminding myself why I was doing what I was doing was always important, and actually has helped me work through a lot of the challenges of the MD PhD training. So that brings us finally to some parting thoughts and a little bit of a bird's eye view at my whole MD PhD trajectory. Came in really curious to understand what mental health was all about. You know, where in the brain does this live? How can it be possible that depression blunts you and decouples inputs? It makes it so that whatever's happening in your life, whether it's a birthday or whether it's spiders, how can you output something that looks like a decrease in emotional range? Using the PhD as an opportunity to study mental health was, I think, crucial in that it gave me an opportunity to leverage modern tools of engineering to study this still mysterious thing that we call emotion. And I came out of the PhD very excited at the future of not only studying depression, but also treating depression. But also importantly is the fact that our mental health through MD PhD training is also crucially important. And you're going to be dealing with the challenges of both med school and grad school. And those challenges are actually very different from each other, and in some ways opposed to each other. That as you learn to deal with grad school challenges, you actually become worse at dealing with med school challenges. And as you get better at med school challenges, you get worse at dealing with grad school challenges. So having a group of people around you that supports you and really serves as your foundation is crucially important. That picture right there is a group of MD PhDs that started in 2011. And so that's the cohort that was my family, is my family. Then we went through a lot together, and that is a little bit of what you're going to be choosing when you choose an MD PhD program. Who are your colleagues? Who are the people that are going to be evolving through this very challenging process with you, and how are you going to support them, and how are they going to support you? Some actually final parting thoughts. Wherever you end up, take risks. MD PhDs have quite a bit of job security because we are clinicians first and foremost. And clinical medicine is timeless, and you'll always have the clinical fallback. But being risky with the PhD gives you the ability to be a little bit more of a pioneer than maybe others can, just because you have the ability to ask riskier questions and more challenging questions. Find a place when you're choosing a program, and Emory may or may not be the right program for you, but the fact that you've made it to where you are means we're colleagues. We are going to be colleagues. And I cannot tell you how many times I've seen folks that I interviewed with, that hosted me, that talked me through the MD PhD application process. I've seen them countless times since I started in 2011. So always feel free to reach out to folks, and we will always try our best to let you know what factors in which schools are the best fit. And one of the things that I think is important for MD PhDs is to learn how to be a leader and how to be a teammate. And choosing a school is crucially important for this, because you want to go somewhere where you have space to explore, space to become a leader in the field or in the interests that you want to do. And that can be tough depending on whether the city you go to or the school you go to already has a lot of people that are trying hard to do that already. Grad school is all about learning how to fail. Science is pretty straightforward. Science is pretty rigorous, and science is relentlessly effective. Grad school is not necessarily about science. Grad school is about doing science while life happens. It's about doing science while you fail at doing science. How do you pick yourself back up? How do you learn to do tomorrow what didn't work today? And that's really at the core of what grad school is about. And I like to say that if you're not taking 4 years in grad school to fail, if you're not taking 4 years to struggle, then you failed in choosing your question in the first place. You didn't choose an interesting enough question. Our job is to really be at the edge of understanding. And at the edge of understanding, there's really not a lot that can help you besides going through it and really trying to figure things out for yourself. Travel as much as you can, wherever you can. I think I've talked plenty about that. Learn math. This is a little bit of a soapbox of mine. Math never goes obsolete. When I started in 2011, optogenetics was huge. 2013, optogenetics was huge. Optogenetics is still important, but what we're noticing is that the field of DBS has actually moved very quickly in the absence of optogenetics. And a lot of that is because we're trying to understand why this old way of doing it, this electrical stim way of doing it, is actually working effectively. And a lot of the tools that I leveraged to make sense of my data are timeless methods that have actually existed for 50, 60 years. And modern machine learning enables us to use data in the context of those techniques, but the math that forms the core of it has actually not changed and has only improved. And that's a powerful tool as a physician scientist because training is so long, and choosing a PhD and a set of skills that will be timeless will come back and really benefit you. And finally, for MD PhD training especially, it's the journey that matters, not necessarily the destination. Learning how to navigate the world, learning how to adapt to changing environments is something that we have always trained in. MD PhD programs have always trained in that. And I think that's going to be very important moving forward, to learn the skills needed to navigate, to journey, and not so much hoping you end up where you wanted to end up 9 years ago, because where you want to end up is going to change. It should change as you learn more and more about what opportunities are available for MD PhDs. So with that, I want to say thank you very much, and thank you, Henry, as well, for listening to me. I have clearly loved my time here at Emory and at Georgia Tech and beyond, and have not enough time to say all the good things that I want to say about the program here, but I am always eager to chat with y'all. So feel free to reach out at my Emory email address, or if there's some resources that are helpful, if you want to hear a little bit more about my perspective and a little bit more about the work that I did for my PhD, you can also visit vineet.tiruvati.com, where I talk a little bit more about that. And as the final parting word, we'll talk about this fancy little picture here. What this is it's actually the math of exploration. It's how do you go find that beautiful red spot, that target? How do you find the thing that you want as it's changing? And really the only answer to that is you want to be as broad as possible. You want to explore as widely as possible. And a lot of those lessons come back and really help you in both residency and beyond. So with that, I want to thank you again and turn it over to Henry.
Oh, well, awesome, Vineet. Thank you so much. That was awesome. I really appreciate you coming to talk to me and all the prospective students who are going to be watching. I think I'm going to stick to one question, but I just feel like one thing that's really amazing about your particular story is the flexibility you were granted to really expand what you wanted to do and how you wanted to do it. And you really did get to, as evidenced by this talk, like create your own trajectory. And obviously a lot of institutions were there for that, but also knew that they were taking a risk just as you were. Could you talk a little bit about the mentorship or the support that you received from Emory and Georgia Tech in your pursuit of kind of doing these things you wanted to do?
Yes, absolutely. I think one of the best things you can get in a mentor, and this is a good point, you want to go to a place, you want to choose a program that has multiple mentors that can help you. Multiple mentors that are invested in you, multiple mentors that see you as a colleague that they are training, and not so much as someone who just does the work that their grant demands has to be done. And that's ultimately what it came down to. So Dr. Helen Mayberg and Dr. Rob Butero were fantastic. They were co-advisors, but when I joined the labs, there was no co-project between the two of them. But both of them were very supportive of this direction, because I think both of them saw the value possibly that bringing engineering into DBS would, what the benefits of that actually were. So the mentorship that I received was it was almost like, I like to describe it as guardrails on a highway. So the mentors were there not to steer me. They weren't there to tell me, okay, switch lanes, okay, take this exit. They gave me a car, they gave me the financial support, and then they provided me with the rails, saying, you know, if you start rubbing up against this, or if you start going past this, there might be a problem. So if you come up on the rails, I'll let you know. But as long as you're moving forward in some direction, as long as you're moving towards something that makes sense, you know, we're going to give you the opportunity to do it. And having a mentor with the vision, which Helen Mayberg is full of vision.
Yeah.
Having a mentor with vision to say, you know what, I disagree with the methods you're using because I don't necessarily think they've been used before, but we're going to discuss it. I'm not going to veto it, was absolutely crucial. So she always gave me the opportunity to explain why these random tools from control theory and these random tools from engineering were the most appropriate tools for us to achieve what we wanted. So I think that has been probably the most important type of mentorship that I could have received in 2011. Things are changing now. A lot of the things that I mentioned are actually now mainstays of the field. People are using machine learning in deep brain stimulation. People are using control theory in deep brain stimulation. So you might want to look at mentorship that is very different than the type of mentorship I had, where you'll have people who have grants that do exactly this, and it's something that resonates with you. But ask them, you get a feel from them how open they are to independent thought, how open they are to an independent project. And that tells you a lot about whether they consider you a colleague or whether they consider you someone who just comes in and does some work for them.
Yeah, and I think that was something that drew me to Emory, the MD PhD program more broadly too, is I feel like the directors of this program very much want you to explore and want you to fail and want you to figure out what you're going to do. Because I know that a lot of other programs, there might be some pressure to graduate in a certain amount of time, and that's just not the case here. Like, people are really given full range to do what they need to do, which I think is really awesome.
Absolutely, I agree.
All right, well, thank you so much, Vineet, and thank you everyone for tuning in. I'll see you next time.
Great.
And